There exists an ancient principle in international relations. No power can project unlimited military force thousands of kilometers from its shores without the consent of local nations. For 75 years, the United States defied this principle in the Taiwan Strait. But this week, that defiance has come to an end. Admiral Samuel Paparo, commander of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, has just confirmed what many of us feared. China now effectively controls the Taiwan Strait, not through a dramatic invasion, not with a declaration of war, but through something far more sophisticated: the establishment of exclusion zones that the U.S. Navy simply cannot penetrate without risking direct confrontation. We're talking about 180 kilometers of water separating mainland China from Taiwan. For decades, American aircraft carriers navigated these waters freely, sending a clear message. Washington guaranteed Taiwan's de facto independence. That era has ended. And what the corporate media doesn't want you to know is that this change wasn't sudden. It was the inevitable result of 30 years of Chinese strategic decisions, while the United States wasted $8 trillion on Middle Eastern wars. I worked at the International Monetary Fund. I've seen this pattern before. When a hegemonic power loses control of critical trade routes, it's not just a military defeat, it's the first visible symptom of a systemic realignment of global power. Let me take you through the history they've hidden from you. The history of how the United States built its dominance in Asia, not through cooperation, but through direct military intervention and systematic economic coercion. 1950, the Korean War. The United States militarily intervenes in an Asian civil war, establishing 35,000 soldiers in South Korea who remain there to this day. Cost to the American taxpayer, $67 billion in current terms. Result: the peninsula remains divided, an open wound in the heart of Asia. 1954. The CIA orchestrates the coup d'etat against the democratically elected government of Guatemala under Jacobo Arbenz. His crime? Attempting to nationalize unused lands of the United Fruit Company. This event establishes the pattern. Any Latin American or Asian nation that challenges American corporate interests will be destabilized. The operation cost $18 million. The precedent: invaluable for the empire. 1964 to 1975. Vietnam. The United States bombs Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam with more explosive tonnage than all that used in World War II. 7 million tons of bombs, $168 billion spent, 58,000 American soldiers killed, millions of Asians killed, and in the end, total defeat. But the lesson was never learned. 1971. The Nixon shock. The United States unilaterally abandons the gold standard, transforming the dollar into a fiat currency backed only by American military force. This forces all nations to maintain dollar reserves to trade oil and other commodities. Asia becomes trapped in a monetary system that drains its wealth toward Wall Street. Japan, in particular, is forced to buy hundreds of billions in U.S. Treasury bonds, financing Washington's deficit. 1997. The Asian financial crisis. The IMF, controlled by the United States, imposes devastating structural adjustment programs on Thailand, Indonesia, and South Korea. Economies are forced to open their financial markets prematurely. Western speculators benefit. Local populations suffer. I was there. I saw how the fund's policies destroyed the Thai middle class in a matter of months. $120 billion in IMF loans came with conditions that guaranteed Western economic domination. 2001. After September 11th, the United States establishes a network of military bases that completely surrounds China. Afghanistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, plus existing bases in Japan, South Korea, Guam, the Philippines. The Pentagon budget explodes from $300 billion to more than $800 billion annually. China observes, China learns, China plans. 2011. Obama's pivot to Asia. Hillary Clinton announces that 60% of the U.S. Navy will be repositioned toward the Pacific. This is not defense. This is provocation. It's the explicit announcement that the United States intends to militarily contain Chinese economic rise. Beijing receives the message clearly. 2018, Trump's trade war. $360 billion in tariffs imposed unilaterally on Chinese goods. The justification: protecting American manufacturing jobs. The reality: a desperate attempt to slow Chinese technological growth through economic sanctions. 2020. Mike Pompeo, Trump's Secretary of State, visits Taiwan, breaking decades of strategic ambiguity. The United States begins selling advanced weapons systems to Taipei. $18 billion in military sales between 2019 and 2023. Each sale is a direct provocation against the One China principle that the United States officially recognizes. This is not international cooperation. This is domination through military force and economic blackmail. For 75 years, Asia was treated as a region that existed solely to serve American strategic interests. So what happened? Lloyd Austin, U.S. Secretary of Defense, now faces the gravest strategic dilemma since the Cuban Missile Crisis. His annual budget, $842 billion. His problem: that massive money cannot buy the one thing he needs: the ability to project naval power in waters that China now considers its own. Let me explain the brutal irony of this situation. For 75 years, the United States had a magic trick. It could station aircraft carriers 150 kilometers from Chinese shores, and Beijing couldn't do absolutely anything about it. The technology simply didn't exist to challenge a U.S. carrier battle group. Those days are over. China now possesses the most sophisticated anti-ship missile arsenal on the planet. The DF-21D, dubbed the carrier killer, has a range of 1,800 kilometers. The DF-26 reaches 4,000 kilometers. These are not conventional missiles that an aircraft carrier can easily intercept. They are hypersonic ballistic missiles that descend from the upper atmosphere at speeds exceeding Mach 10. Current U.S. naval defense systems have an estimated interception rate of 30% against this type of threat. Do the math. A U.S. aircraft carrier costs $13 billion. It carries 5,000 sailors. A single DF-26 missile costs approximately $3 million. China can produce hundreds per year. The strategic equation has fundamentally changed. The United States can no longer guarantee the survival of its most valuable naval assets within range of Chinese missiles. And that range now includes the entire Taiwan Strait. But here's the real nightmare keeping Lloyd Austin awake at night. He cannot simply order a military confrontation. Why? Because China holds $1.2 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds. You cannot declare war on your own banker. This is the central contradiction of the American empire in the 21st century. Washington needs Beijing to finance its massive budget deficit of $2 trillion annually. But simultaneously, Washington attempts to militarily contain Beijing. It's an inherently contradictory strategy, and it's collapsing in real time. Pentagon strategists have tried 4 approaches to manage this dilemma. First, integrated deterrence. The idea that regional allies like Japan, South Korea, and Australia would share the cost of containing China. This has failed because these nations have massive trade relationships with China. Japan trades $270 billion annually with China. They're not going to risk that for American naval primacy. Second, technological modernization. Investing hundreds of billions in new weapons systems that supposedly would restore American advantage. The problem: China is innovating faster. Beijing graduates 4 times more engineers than the United States annually. Their military research budget grows 15% annually. Third, coercive diplomacy. Attempting to pressure China through sanctions and technological restrictions. This has failed spectacularly. The semiconductor sanctions of 2022 simply accelerated Chinese domestic development of advanced chips. Beijing now produces 7-nanometer chips independently of Western companies. Fourth, and here comes the supreme irony, Austin must now negotiate with China to avoid accidental military escalation in the Taiwan Strait. The aggressor must beg the aggressed for lines of communication to prevent a war the aggressor cannot win. This is the deepest strategic humiliation the United States has experienced since Vietnam, and the American public remains completely unaware. Corporate media reports on, quote, tensions over Taiwan without explaining the fundamental reality. The United States has lost naval dominance in the Western Pacific. It's not losing, it already lost. The transition has already happened. The world simply hasn't realized it yet. Now, I want to mention here John Mearsheimer, professor of political science at the University of Chicago and one of the most respected international relations theorists of our era. Mearsheimer has argued for decades that great power competition is inevitable in an anarchic international system. His theory of offensive realism predicts exactly what we're witnessing. According to Mearsheimer, when a rising power like China reaches the ability to project power in its own region, it will inevitably challenge the hegemony of the established power. Not because Chinese leaders are aggressive or expansionist by nature, but because the very structure of the international system incentivizes them to maximize their power to guarantee their own survival. The United States did exactly this in the Western Hemisphere during the 19th century. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 declared that the Americas were an exclusive American sphere of influence. Washington intervened militarily in Latin America dozens of times to secure that regional hegemony. China is simply replicating this pattern in East Asia. Graham Allison of Harvard has documented 16 historical cases where a rising power challenged an established power. In 12 of these cases, the result was war. Allison calls this the Thucydides trap. We're living inside this trap right now. The question is not whether China will challenge American primacy in Asia. It's already doing so. The question is whether this transition can occur without war. Stephen Walt, also from Harvard, adds another critical dimension. His balance of threat theory explains why America's Asian allies are wavering. Nations don't simply align with the strongest, but against the greatest threat. For many Asian states, the greatest threat is no longer China, but the economic chaos that would result from a US-China war. Trade with China exceeds trade with the United States for nearly every country in the region. Michael Beckley of Tufts College has attempted to argue that the United States maintains structural advantages over China. Younger demographics, technological superiority, stronger alliances. But even Beckley admits these advantages are irrelevant if the United States cannot project effective military power in the relevant theater of operations. And currently, it cannot. Academic theory converges with operational reality. China has achieved what strategists call area denial, the ability to make a specific geographic space too dangerous for enemy forces to operate within it. The Taiwan Strait now falls within this Chinese area denial zone. But this is not just a military defeat. It's the visible symptom of a much deeper systemic collapse. The global order that emerged after World War II rested on two fundamental pillars. Both are breaking simultaneously. The first pillar is the petrodollar system. In 1974, Henry Kissinger negotiated an agreement with Saudi Arabia. The Saudis would sell oil exclusively in dollars and recycle the profits buying U.S. Treasury bonds. In exchange, the United States would guarantee the security of the Saudi regime. This agreement extended to all oil-exporting countries in the Persian Gulf. The result was brilliant for Washington. Every nation that needed to import oil had to maintain massive dollar reserves. This created constant artificial demand for American currency, allowing Washington to print money without facing immediate inflation. America's $800 billion annual trade deficit was only possible because the world needed those dollars to buy energy. This system is collapsing. In March 2023, Saudi Arabia completed its first oil sale to China, denominated in yuan. It wasn't a symbolic transaction. It was 150 million barrels. The precedent is established. Russia now sells natural gas to China exclusively in yuan and rubles. Iran sells oil to China, bypassing the dollar completely. Brazil and China have just agreed to trade in their own currencies, eliminating the dollar as intermediary. Do the math. China imports 11 million barrels of oil daily. At $100 per barrel, that's $1,100,000,000 daily, 400 billion annually. If even 30% of that trade is de-dollarized, we're talking about a reduction of $120 billion in annual demand for American currency. Multiply that by all the economies participating in this de-dollarization, and the scale becomes existential for the United States. The second pillar is the Treasury bond system. The United States spends $2 trillion more than it collects in taxes each year. This gap is financed by selling Treasury bonds to foreign investors. China, Japan, and Gulf countries have been the largest buyers, but this dynamic is reversing. China has reduced its holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds from $1,300,000,000,000 in 2013 to $780 billion in 2024. They're not selling dramatically because that would collapse the value of their remaining holdings. They're allowing bonds to mature without reinvesting. It's a slow and calculated exit. Japan, traditionally the largest foreign holder, now faces its own massive fiscal problems. Its government debt is 260% of its GDP. Tokyo can no longer afford to finance America's deficit while managing its own. Japanese purchases of Treasury bonds fell 42% in 2023. Who's filling the void? The Federal Reserve. The American Central Bank is buying Treasury bonds issued by the American government. This is, in technical terms, debt monetization. In simple terms, it's printing money to finance government spending. Historically, this policy always ends in severe inflation or monetary collapse. Are you enjoying the analysis? If this information is opening your eyes, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Join thousands of people who are awakening to the geopolitical reality that corporate media hides. Like this video to help more people access this content. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching this from? I want to know what countries are represented in this community seeking truth beyond official propaganda. As these two pillars crumble, an alternative is emerging. It's not theoretical. It's not futuristic. It's happening now. The BRICS, originally just Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, now include Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. Saudi Arabia is actively considering membership. These nations represent 42% of global population and 31% of world GDP. In August 2023, the BRICS summit in Johannesburg announced concrete plans for an alternative payment system to SWIFT, the Western-dominated system that processes international transfers. Russia and China have already implemented bilateral systems. China's cross-border interbank payment system processed 80 trillion yuan in 2023, equivalent to $11 trillion. More significantly, the BRICS are discussing a reserve currency backed by commodities, gold, oil, grains, rare metals. This is not speculation. Central banks of BRICS countries have been aggressively accumulating gold. China increased its gold reserves by 17% just in 2023. Russia has increased its gold holdings from 600 tons in 2010 to 2,300 tons in 2024. A currency backed by real commodities solves the fundamental problem of the fiat dollar. Its value depends entirely on confidence that the United States will pay its debts. But the United States has $35 trillion in national debt, growing $2 trillion annually. The debt to GDP ratio is 129%. Historically, no nation has maintained such a debt burden without eventually inflating its currency or defaulting. Here's the domino effect that conventional analysts aren't discussing. If the BRICS launch a commodity-backed currency, nations with large natural resource reserves will have incentives to trade outside the dollar system. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves on the planet, 303 billion barrels. Iran has the second largest natural gas reserves, 32 trillion cubic meters. Russia has vast resources of almost everything: energy, grains, metals, rare minerals. If these countries begin selling their resources in a gold-backed BRICS currency, the dollar's value will collapse because there will no longer be forced demand for dollars to buy energy and raw materials. Inflation in the United States would accelerate dramatically. Treasury bonds would lose value. The U.S. government would face an immediate fiscal crisis because it could no longer finance its deficit by selling debt at artificially low interest rates. And here's the detail that connects all this back to the Taiwan Strait. Taiwan produces 65% of the world's advanced semiconductors. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company is literally the most important company on the planet for the modern digital economy. Every smartphone, every computer, every artificial intelligence system depends on chips manufactured in Taiwan. The United States desperately needs these semiconductors, but it can no longer militarily guarantee access to them. China can blockade the Taiwan Strait at any time, cutting off chip exports to the Western world. This is Beijing's ultimate card. They don't need to invade Taiwan. They only need to blockade it economically until Taipei accepts reunification on Chinese terms. Washington knows this. That's why the United States is investing $52 billion to build domestic semiconductor plants through the CHIPS Act. But it will take 5 to 7 years to build this capacity. China can act much sooner. Now let me connect this to your daily life, because these geopolitical transformations are not abstract. They're going to hit you directly in your wallet. They already are. Your local supermarket has seen food prices increase 40% since 2020. The official narrative blames COVID disruptions. That's only part of the story. The deeper reality is that dollar inflation is accelerating because the world is abandoning American currency. When there's less demand for dollars, each dollar in your pocket is worth less. You buy less with the same money. Your gas bill. Energy prices are disconnecting from the petrodollar reality. When Saudi Arabia sells oil to China in yuan, it doesn't need to keep those earnings in dollars. It can use them to buy Chinese goods directly. This reduces dollar liquidity globally, pushing prices up in the United States and Europe, even when global oil prices fall. Your savings. If you have money in a bank or in treasury bonds, you're losing purchasing power in real time. Official inflation is 4.2% annually. Real inflation, measured by the cost of essential goods, is closer to 8%. Treasury bonds pay 3.5%. You're losing 4.5% of purchasing power annually. In a decade, your savings will be worth 35% less in real terms. Your employment. The industrial offshoring to China that destroyed millions of American manufacturing jobs was just the first phase. The second phase is beginning now. As China dominates semiconductors, batteries, solar panels, electric vehicles, the American economy is relegated to low-value added services. Well-paying technology jobs will migrate to Asia along with manufacturing. But here's the genuine hope. A multipolar world is not necessarily worse than a unipolar world dominated by Washington. In fact, it could be significantly better for most of humanity. When no single power can impose its will globally, small nations gain room to maneuver. They can trade with multiple powers, negotiating better terms. Latin America, for example, is benefiting enormously. China is now the largest trading partner for Brazil, Chile, Peru, and Argentina. These nations can export soybeans, copper, lithium, meat to China, while importing Chinese manufactured products cheaper than American alternatives. This improves the standard of living for populations that were historically exploited by American corporations backed by the IMF and World Bank. Africa is seeing massive Chinese investment in infrastructure, railways, ports, electrical grids. China has built more infrastructure in Africa in 20 years than Europe did in 100 years of colonialism. Yes, China is securing access to African resources. But unlike Western colonialism, It's leaving functional infrastructure that will remain afterward. This is not the end of the world. It's the end of a particular world, a world where a single power could project military and economic domination globally without checks. That world is ending. What comes after is uncertain, but not necessarily worse. It depends on whether power elites in Washington accept this new reality peacefully or attempt to preserve their hegemony through war. You are witnessing how the foundations of world order are being reorganized. Every decision about the Taiwan Strait, every de-dollarized oil transaction, every kilogram of gold bought by BRICS central banks, every advanced semiconductor produced in China is another brick removed from the building of the post-1945 global order. The building is still standing, but the cracks are visible to anyone who wants to see them.